Sony had a goldmine, a record-breaking exclusive that saved their 2024 lineup, and they just let it walk right out the door. Today, we're talking about why the creators of Stellar Blade are escaping PlayStation, and why they might never look back. In 2024, Sony is in full live service mode. They're burning hundreds of millions of dollars trying to chase the Fortnite and Destiny crowd. They are releasing game after game, Concord, Helldivers 2, a whole pipeline of multiplayer experiments, hoping that one of them sticks. Their character design philosophy has drifted so far from what built PlayStation's legacy that the heroes of new Sony titles are becoming genuinely difficult to recognize as heroes at all. And sitting quietly in the middle of all of this chaos, published under the PlayStation tent, is a game from a South Korean studio that most of the Western gaming press had never taken seriously. That game was Stellar Blade. And here's the thing about Stellar Blade that should deeply embarrass the people running Sony Interactive Entertainment right now. They had a goldmine in their hands. A game with phenomenal combat, a stunning protagonist, a killer soundtrack, and a design philosophy that connected with millions of players across the world. The kind of connection that money cannot manufacture. A game that broke PlayStation user score records on Metacritic. A game that sold over 1 million copies on PC in 3 days. A game whose developer then went public on the Korean Stock Exchange and raised $320 million in one of the most explosive gaming IPOs in years. And now that developer, Shift Up, appears to be walking straight out the door. The signs are everywhere if you know where to look. New job listings, self-publishing ambitions, a sequel with no publisher attached, a studio that no longer seems to need Sony's marketing machine or Sony's money. And given the way the relationship between these two companies actually played out, you can absolutely not blame them. Sony had the golden goose. They shook it, plucked it, and tried to put it in PlayStation Network chains. And now the goose is spreading its wings. Here is the full story of how one of PlayStation's biggest recent successes became the story that might haunt them for the rest of this generation. And why Shift Up going independent might actually be one of the best things to happen to gaming in years. And I want to start with the moment that, looking back, was probably the beginning of the end. Of graffiti that most players never even noticed. To understand why Shift Up might be done with Sony, you have to understand what it actually felt like to be a Stellar Blade fan over the past couple of years. Because there were 3 separate moments where Sony's handling of this game made you wonder if they were actively trying to sabotage it. And by the time we get to the 3rd one, you will not be asking why Shift Up is leaving. You will be asking why they stayed as long as they did. Right out of the gate, before the game had even been in people's hands long enough to form a proper opinion, Stellar Blade got hit with controversy. And some of that controversy was manufactured, some of it was genuine, but the way Sony responded told you everything you need to know about where their priorities were. If you were following the game's launch, you remember this. Journalists spotted text in the game's environmental art that they claimed contained a racial slur. To be precise, it was the letter arrangement in some background graffiti that, with a significant stretch of the imagination, could be read as a reference to the hard R. Gaming outlets ran with it. Hit pieces were written, and Sony, rather than standing behind their developer and saying, wait, let's look at this properly, caved almost immediately. Shift Up was forced to patch the game and remove the graffiti. Now, whether you believe that graffiti was intentional or a complete coincidence, and the developer's explanation was that it was, the response from Sony was telling. 0 pushback, 0 protection of the developer's creative work, just immediate compliance with whoever was yelling the loudest. And that is a hostage situation. And it did not stop there. Fans noticed that certain costume designs in the game were altered from what had been shown in earlier promotional materials. Outfits that appeared in gameplay previews arrived in the final product slightly modified, less revealing, more conservative. Sony denied any censorship had taken place, but the comparisons were documented side by side online, and the community was not satisfied with the denial. The perception that Sony was quietly sanitizing Shift Up's creative vision had taken hold, and it was hard to shake. For a studio whose entire design philosophy is built on creating aesthetically fearless characters, a philosophy that directly produced Eve, one of the most beloved action game protagonists in years, having a publisher quietly nudge your work toward a more acceptable look is not a small thing. It is a fundamental creative violation. If the graffiti controversy told you about Sony's instinct to capitulate to bad faith criticism, the Steam launch told you something even worse about them. It told you about their instinct to prioritize ecosystem control over their own game's commercial success. When Stellar Blade launched on PC through Steam in June 2025, Sony initially required players to link a PlayStation Network account just to play on Steam, a PC platform, not a PlayStation. And here is the critical critical detail that makes genuinely indefensible. PlayStation Network is not available in over 180 countries worldwide. Countries where it is literally impossible to create a PSN account because Sony does not operate the service there. So what Sony's requirement actually meant in practice was this. Customers in those 180 plus countries could see Stellar Blade on Steam. They could click buy, but they could not play the game. They were paying for something they were being locked out of. The game briefly faced delisting in those regions. Real customers being cut off from a product they wanted and were willing to pay for. So Sony could get those players into their ecosystem. So Sony could harvest account data. So Sony could try to build their network numbers off the back of a game that Shift Up made. The backlash was enormous and immediate. The gaming community exploded. Sony eventually relented, but the damage was done. Not just commercially, not just in terms of community goodwill, but in terms of what Shift Up must have understood about what Sony's priorities actually were. It was not their game, but Sony's leverage. After going through an experience like that, would you renew that publishing deal? Would you willingly hand the keys to your next project to a company that proved, under pressure, that your game's reach mattered less to them than their network sign-up metrics? Now, you could argue that the graffiti controversy and the PSN disaster were just operational failures. Bad decisions, badly executed, but fixable. Corporate clumsiness, not malice. And maybe that argument holds, if it were not for the third thing. Because the third thing is not a mistake you fix with a patch. It is a fundamental mismatch in values. And it goes right to the heart of why Stellar Blade exists at all. There is a deeper philosophical incompatibility here too, and it is worth naming directly. Sony's first-party output over the last several years has trended in a very specific direction. Character design choices have become what many fans describe as safe, or alternatively, shaped by a particular set of cultural pressures around representation that prioritize political messaging over aesthetic impact. Look at the designs from Concord, which bombed spectacularly. Look at the leads from Intergalactic, The Heretic Prophet. Look at the direction of Horizon as the series has progressed. These are not universally bad games, but there is a clear house style emerging at Sony adjacent studios, and it is a house style that a significant portion of the gaming audience has been visibly rejecting. Stellar Blade is the photo negative of that trend. Eve is an unapologetically striking, expertly crafted character. She is the kind of design that gets people to cosplay, to create fan art by the thousands, to fall in love with the game before they have even touched the gameplay. She represents a design philosophy, the one Shift Up's director, Kim Hyung-tae, has built his entire career on, that trusts the audience to appreciate craft without hedging or apology. That philosophy and Sony's current creative direction are not compatible. They are pulling in opposite directions. And when the studio making the games is philosophically misaligned with the publisher financing them, you can patch your graffiti, you can adjust your outfits, you can survive one terrible Steam launch, but eventually the relationship fractures. It has to. Sony was never going to let Shift Up be Shift Up. Not fully, not without friction, and Shift Up is finally in a position to do something about that. Which brings us to the part of this story that most people are sleeping on. Because everyone is talking about this like it is a creative breakup, a developer walking away from a publisher that stifled their vision. And that is true, but it is only half the story. The other half is a number, and once you hear the number, the creative argument almost becomes secondary. Here is where the story gets genuinely exciting, because what Shift Up is doing right now is not just a creative decision, it is a business masterstroke, and the numbers behind it are extraordinary. Let us start with the IPO, because this is the foundation of everything. In July 2024, Shift Up went public on the Korea Exchange. They raised 435 billion won, roughly $320 million. At the time, it was the largest public offering for a gaming company in South Korea since PUBG publisher Krafton raised $3.8 billion back in 2021. Investor demand was so intense that applications for shares exceeded available supply by 226 times. 226 times. That is not a studio scraping by. That is a studio that the global investment community looked at and said, "We believe in this team." And they have been putting that capital to work. In 2024, Shift Up achieved annual revenue of roughly 219.8 billion won, reflecting approximately 30% year-over-year growth. The studio expanded its headcount. It gave employees PlayStation 5 Pros as a bonus for Stellar Blade's success. It has been building, hiring, and investing at a pace that reflects serious institutional ambition. The PC launch of Stellar Blade alone, which came over a year after the PlayStation 5 release, sold more than 1 million copies in its first 3 days on the market. In 3 days. On a platform where the game had already been available to pirate for over a year. That is what legitimate demand looks like. That is what happens when you build something people actually want. Now here is the part that every developer understands viscerally and that most players never really think about. When a publisher finances and distributes your game, they take a cut. Sometimes a small cut, often a very large cut. Reports in the gaming industry frequently cite publisher revenue shares ranging from 25% on the low end all the way up to 50 or even 70% of net revenue for deals with heavy upfront funding. For Stellar Blade, Sony was the publisher. That means a meaningful portion of every copy sold on PlayStation 5, on PC, went back to Sony. We know from ShiftUp's own securities filings that the revenue they recognized from Stellar Blade in the months immediately after launch was measured in the billions of won, but it represented only what Sony paid out to them from the game's total commercial performance. Sony was keeping the rest. If ShiftUp self-publishes Stellar Blade 2, they keep all of that. Every dollar from every Xbox sale, every dollar from every PC sale, every dollar from every PlayStation sale. No revenue share, no publishing approval process, no one with the power to demand a last-minute patch on your graffiti or a PSN login gate on your PC launch. One commenter on gaming forums put it bluntly and correctly. Publishers can take up to 90% of revenue, leaving developers dependent on that relationship forever just to stay afloat. ShiftUp has broken that cycle. They have the war chest to fund their own development and their own marketing. They do not need Sony's money anymore. And without needing Sony's money, they do not need Sony's conditions. The recent job postings ShiftUp has made public are not subtle. In listings translated and reported by gaming outlet Automaton via South Korean site Game Mecha, ShiftUp's own language is explicit. ShiftUp is preparing for a new leap forward in the global market, beyond the worldwide success of Goddess of Victory Nikke and Stellar Blade. We aim to expand our self-publishing capabilities to support internally developed titles across consoles and PC. The roles being advertised include communications manager, creative lead, marketing manager, and multiple localization positions. These are not the job listings of a developer. These are the job listings of a publisher in formation. They are building the infrastructure to reach every platform, every region, every potential customer, entirely on their own terms. Among the preferred candidate qualifications listed for some of these roles, having earned the Platinum Trophy in Stellar Blade. They are not just hiring professionals, they are hiring fans. They are building a publishing division staffed by people who love what they make. That is a culture statement as much as a business one. But here's the thing nobody is talking about loudly enough yet. All of this, the IPO, the hiring, the self-publishing push, only matters if the game goes somewhere Sony cannot follow it. And there is a very specific platform that represents billions of dollars in untapped Stellar Blade revenue that Sony has been sitting on like a guard dog. We need to talk about what happens when ShiftUp finally walks past that dog. All right, let us get to the thing that PlayStation loyalists are least excited to hear about. Because if ShiftUp self-publishes Stellar Blade 2, the era of PlayStation exclusivity is almost certainly over, and the implications for the platform war are significant. The original Stellar Blade launched as a PlayStation 5 exclusive on April 26, 2024. The PC version did not arrive until June 2025, more than a year later. That gap was a function of the publishing arrangement with Sony. It was not a technical limitation. Sony's strategy, particularly in the early years of the PS5, was to use major titles as exclusivity weapons. You want to play this? Buy the console. That strategy may have made sense in a different era. In 2024 and 2025, it is increasingly anachronistic. The PC gaming market is enormous, and Stellar Blade's performance on PC proved that definitively. Over 1 million copies in 3 days. That is not a secondary market. That is a primary market that was kept waiting for 14 months for commercial and strategic reasons that had nothing to do with what players wanted. If ShiftUp self-publishes Stellar Blade 2, there is no reason for a staggered release. The game would launch on PC simultaneously with consoles. And given that ShiftUp's own job listings specifically mention support for consoles, plural, not PlayStation, the implication of an Xbox and potentially Nintendo version is hard to ignore. The community has already been discussing this loudly. Reddit threads covering the self-publishing news are full of players on Xbox and PC expressing genuine excitement about the possibility of playing a day one Stellar Blade 2. Recent reporting has also confirmed that ShiftUp is actively evaluating bringing the original Stellar Blade to platforms beyond PS5 and PC, with Xbox Series X and the Nintendo Switch 2 apparently being explored. If they are willing to port the first game to those platforms, the idea that the sequel would skip them entirely becomes very difficult to defend. There is one more layer to this that makes Sony's position even weaker. According to recent reporting, Sony itself is reportedly reconsidering its PC port strategy, with internal discussions suggesting the company may pull back from PC releases and return to a more exclusivity-focused approach, because they believe their PC releases did not meet financial expectations. Let that sink in. PlayStation PC releases that included Spider-Man, God of War, The Last of Us, supposedly did not meet expectations, and their response might be to do fewer of them, while simultaneously, Shift Up's PC launch of Stellar Blade hit 1 million copies in 3 days. If Sony pulls back to console exclusives while Shift Up goes multi-platform, the result is predictable. Stellar Blade 2 will be available to the entire global gaming audience simultaneously. PlayStation will get the game because PlayStation players love Stellar Blade, and Shift Up has no reason to cut them out. But Xbox players will get it. PC players will get it on day one. Nintendo Switch 2 players may get it. The game will be everywhere, marketed by a studio that built its publishing infrastructure specifically to serve its own IP. For Sony, losing Stellar Blade as an exclusive is not just a business setback, it is a symbolic one. This was one of the only titles they published in the last 2 years that generated genuine, organic enthusiasm from a massive audience. The kind of enthusiasm that you cannot buy with a marketing budget. And they are going to watch it go multi-platform because they could not stop themselves from picking unnecessary fights with the studio that made it. Let us not forget the pure financial logic here. Shift Up is a publicly traded company now. They have shareholders. They have quarterly earnings calls. Choosing to exclude massive platforms like Xbox and Nintendo from a launch is choosing to leave hundreds of millions of dollars on the table. That is a choice that requires justification when you are answering to investors. With Sony as publisher, that justification was, this is what our publishing deal says. Without Sony, there is no justification. The shareholders will want the game everywhere. The players want the game everywhere. The data from the PC launch proves the demand is real and enormous. Multi-platform day one is not just the creatively liberating choice for Shift Up, it is the financially obvious one. So we have a developer leaving a toxic publishing relationship, we have a sequel going multi-platform, we have hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue that Sony is about to lose access to. On paper, this is just a story about a bad business breakup. But I want to make one final argument, and it is the one that I think matters most, because this is not actually a story about Sony losing. It is a story about the entire industry winning. And the reason for that is something most people completely overlook. So let us zoom out. Because this story is bigger than just one developer and one publisher having a falling out, this is about something more fundamental happening in the game industry right now, and it is something worth celebrating. The traditional model of game publishing was born in an era when developers genuinely could not reach players without a publisher's infrastructure. You needed distribution deals, retail relationships, marketing budgets, certification pipelines for console platforms. The barrier to entry was so high that developers basically had no choice but to accept whatever terms publishers offered, because the alternative was invisibility. That model is not completely dead, but it is cracking in important places. Digital distribution changed everything. A developer today can reach every PC gamer on the planet through Steam, with no physical distribution whatsoever. Console certification has become a process that studios can navigate themselves if they have the right team. Marketing through social media, content creator relationships, and community building is increasingly accessible to studios that understand how to speak to their audience. What has historically held developers back from self-publishing is capital. You need money to fund development without a publisher's advance. You need money to run a marketing campaign. You need money to survive the gap between finishing a game and seeing its first sales. That is why so many studios end up signing deals that cost them the majority of their revenue, because the alternative is running out of money before the game ships. Shift Up no longer has that problem. They have $320 million from their IPO. They have ongoing revenue from Goddess of Victory, Nikkei, which generated over $30 million in a single quarter as recently as Q3 2025. They have royalties from continued Stellar Blade sales that are still bringing in close to $20 million per quarter. They are not in survival mode. They are in expansion mode. And from that position, self-publishing is not a risk. It is the rational, obvious next step. There is a reason that the best creative work often happens when the people making it have autonomy over the final product. Not because collaboration is bad, not because publishers never add value, but because the pressure to please a corporate intermediary who has their own strategic agenda, their own platform metrics to hit, their own cultural sensitivities to manage, their own legal teams flagging risks, inevitably introduces friction that has nothing to do with making the best possible game. ShiftUp's vision for Stellar Blade was specific, coherent, and deeply personal. Kim Hyung-tae is not making these games by committee. He has a design language, an aesthetic philosophy, a sense of what he wants his characters and worlds to feel like that is identifiably his. That is rare. That is valuable. And that kind of singular vision does not benefit from a publisher stepping in to say, can we just make this a little less that? Without Sony, ShiftUp can make Stellar Blade 2 exactly as they intended. The outfits will be the outfits they designed. The narrative will be the narrative they wrote. The release will go everywhere they want it to go on the timeline they choose. No forced PSN integrations. No quiet patches after launch. No crisis management because a game journalist decided to squint at graffiti and call it a slur. Just the game made by the people who know how to make it for the audience that loves them. Here is the honest truth about what Sony's approach to Stellar Blade reveals. Sony is increasingly a company that is confused about who it is making games for. Their live service bets have failed spectacularly. Concord became one of the most expensive failures in gaming history, shut down just weeks after launch. Their first-party character design choices have alienated a significant portion of the audience that made PlayStation great. Their PC strategy is reportedly being reconsidered after underperforming their own expectations. Meanwhile, a Korean studio that Sony helped bring to a global audience made something that people genuinely loved. Turned that love into a $320 million IPO and is now building the infrastructure to no longer need Sony at all. That is not Sony's failure to keep ShiftUp. That is Sony's failure to be the kind of partner worth keeping. The industry benefits from ShiftUp going independent in ways that extend beyond just Stellar Blade fans. When a mid-sized studio demonstrates that you can go from an A developer to publicly traded, self-publishing global studio in the space of a few years by making games that people actually want rather than games that check the right institutional boxes, it sends a message. You do not have to take a publisher's deal. You do not have to compromise your vision to survive. You do not have to hand over 50% of your revenue to someone who will then second guess your creative choices. The best developers in the world deserve the creative and financial freedom to make what they are truly capable of making. ShiftUp has earned that freedom. They are claiming it. And the result, whenever Stellar Blade 2 lands, is almost certainly going to be a game made with more creative confidence, distributed more widely, and building a larger audience than anything that could have come from a continued arrangement with Sony. Sony's loss is the industry's gain. If PlayStation will not let ShiftUp be ShiftUp, if they cannot stop themselves from patching out the graffiti, altering the outfits, and locking PC players out of the game so they can capture PSN signups, then ShiftUp is better off without them. And frankly, so are we. Stellar Blade 2 is coming. It is coming before 2027. The development is reportedly progressing in a structured manner, with the location scout confirmed and inspiration drawn from cities like Chongqing, China. It will almost certainly not be a PlayStation exclusive. It will almost certainly launch on PC day one. It may well launch on Xbox and Nintendo Switch 2 as well. It will be made entirely on ShiftUp's terms, by people who earned a platinum trophy in the first game, staffed by a team that loves what they are building. That is the promise of a developer that has outgrown its publisher. That is what creative freedom looks like when it is backed by financial independence. And that is why, even though PlayStation fans might feel the sting of losing an exclusive, the broader story here is a genuinely optimistic one. ShiftUp started as a small Korean mobile studio. They made a gacha game, then another, then bet everything on a $100 million console title with an unapologetic protagonist that half the gaming press wanted to dismiss. They launched it as a PlayStation exclusive, survived the controversies, went public, broke records on PC, and are now standing at the edge of becoming a fully independent global publisher. If that is not a story about nature healing and the industry course correcting towards something better, I do not know what is. Drop your thoughts in the comments.